Hello, everyone. Today we will explore the history of the formation and development of the world's number one superpower. What did they go through to achieve their dominant position today? Please follow along. Phase 1 before America existed. Indigenous civilizations of North America 1. A land before borders, long before the word America was ever spoken, before maps gave this land borders and flags. North America was already alive with human history stretching back tens of thousands of years. This continent was not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a populated world shaped by countless generations of indigenous peoples who adapted to its rivers, plains, deserts, forests, and coasts. They lived not as conquerors of nature, but as participants within it. Villages rose near rivers. Hunting paths followed animal migrations, and sacred sites marked the rhythms of the land itself. 2. The first humans arrived. Most scholars believe the first humans arrived in North America between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, migrating from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age. At the time, sea levels were lower, exposing a frozen corridor of land connecting Siberia to Alaska. These early humans were hunter-gatherers, following animal herds and adapting to harsh climates. Over generations, they moved southward and eastward, spreading across the continent. As environments changed, so did their cultures, technologies, and ways of life. 3. A continent of many worlds, indigenous North America was not a single civilization, but a mosaic of worlds. Geography shaped culture, and culture shaped survival. From deserts to coastlines, each society developed uniquely. By the time Europeans arrived in the late 15th century, North America was home to hundreds of distinct nations, each with its own language, customs, spiritual beliefs, and political systems. 4. Mississippian civilization and Cahokia in the fertile river valleys of the Southeast and Midwest, agricultural societies flourished. Among them, the Mississippian culture stood out as one of the most advanced pre-Columbian civilizations north of Mexico. Its greatest city, Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, reached its height around the 12th century. Massive earthen mounds dominated the landscape, surrounded by planned streets, public plazas, and ceremonial spaces. Cahokia's population may have rivaled that of major European cities of its time. 5. Ancestral Pueblo peoples of the Southwest and the arid Southwest. Ancestral Pueblo peoples faced a harsh environment, but responded with innovation. They built multi-story stone dwellings, often carved directly into canyon cliffs, providing protection and temperature control. They engineered irrigation systems to farm maize, beans, and squash, transforming dry landscapes into sustainable communities. Their pottery, architecture, and art reveal both technical mastery and deep spiritual meaning. 6. Pacific Coast societies along the Pacific Coast. Nature provided abundance. Rich marine ecosystems allowed indigenous societies to thrive without large-scale farming. These communities built wooden longhouses, carved towering totem poles, and crafted canoes capable of ocean travel. Art, ceremony, and social hierarchy were deeply intertwined, reflecting both spiritual beliefs and social status. 7. Nomadic cultures of the Great Plains. Across the vast Great Plains, nomadic societies followed migrating bison herds. Mobility was essential for survival. Communities lived in temporary dwellings and organized life around cooperation and shared responsibility. Although horses would later revolutionize plains cultures, even before European contact, these societies possessed complex spiritual traditions and social structures centered on balance with the land. 8. Northeastern woodlands and the Iroquois Confederacy. In the forests of the Northeast, indigenous nations formed politically sophisticated alliances. The Iroquois Confederacy united multiple nations under a shared system of governance that balanced unity with independence. Decisions were made through councils and consensus, emphasizing diplomacy over domination. Some historians believe these ideas later influenced colonial political thought. 8. Northeastern woodlands and the Iroquois Confederacy in the forests of the Northeast, indigenous nations formed politically sophisticated alliances. The Iroquois Confederacy united multiple nations under a shared system of governance that balanced unity with independence. Decisions were made through councils and consensus, emphasizing diplomacy over domination. Some historians believe these ideas later influenced colonial political thought. 10. Spirituality and relationship with nature. Religion and spirituality were inseparable from daily life. Mountains, rivers, animals, and celestial bodies held sacred meaning. Nature was not something to be conquered, but a living system to be respected. This worldview shaped how indigenous peoples hunted, farmed, governed, and understood their place in the universe. 11. Economy and trade networks. Long before European contact, indigenous North America was economically interconnected. Trade routes stretched across the continent. Exchanging copper, shells, obsidian, furs, and ceremonial objects, along with goods, ideas, and technologies traveled, shaping cultures far beyond their points of origin. 12. A world on the brink of change. By the late 15th century, this indigenous world stood on the edge of a transformation it could not foresee. European arrival would bring new animals and technologies, but also disease, violence, and displacement. The encounter was not merely cultural. It was a collision of worldviews. 13. Closing. The true beginning of America, understanding the origins of the United States, begins here. Not with ships crossing the Atlantic, but with the deep human history already rooted in the land. The story of America did not begin with discovery. It began long before. Phase 2: European colonization and the birth of the 13 colonies. 1. Europe looks west. By the late 15th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Kingdoms were growing stronger, trade was expanding, and competition for wealth and power intensified. Spices, gold, and new trade routes became obsessions of European monarchs. The Atlantic Ocean, once feared as a barrier, began to look like an opportunity. European leaders believed that lands beyond the horizon could bring unimaginable riches and strategic advantage over rival nations. 2. First contact with a New World. European arrival in the Americas marked one of the most transformative and destructive moments in human history. When explorers reached North America, they encountered societies that had existed for thousands of years. These encounters were often cautious at first, sometimes cooperative, sometimes hostile. But even before large-scale colonization began, disease traveled faster than people. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly, devastating indigenous populations who had no immunity. 3. Competing European powers in North America. No single European nation controlled North America. Instead, it became a contested space. Spain established colonies in the south and west. France expanded through river systems and fur trade networks, and England focused on the Atlantic coast. Each power brought different goals, strategies, and relationships with indigenous nations. These rivalries laid the groundwork for centuries of conflict. 3. Competing European powers in North America. No single European nation controlled North America. Instead, it became a contested space. Spain established colonies in the south and west. France expanded through river systems and fur trade networks, and England focused on the Atlantic coast. Each power brought different goals, strategies, and relationships with indigenous nations. These rivalries laid the groundwork for centuries of conflict. 5. The Plymouth Colony and religious migration. In 1620, a different group arrived, the Pilgrims. Fleeing religious persecution, They sought not riches, but the freedom to practice their beliefs. Their settlement at Plymouth faced severe hardship during its first winter. Assistance from local indigenous people made survival possible. Later generations would romanticize this cooperation, but the reality remained complex and fragile. 6. Growth of the 13 colonies over time. English settlements multiplied along the Atlantic coast. These colonies developed distinct regional identities. The New England colonies emphasized trade, fishing, and religious communities. The middle colonies became centers of commerce and cultural diversity. The southern colonies relied heavily on agriculture, especially tobacco and rice. Despite differences, all colonies remained under British control. 7. Slavery and the colonial economy. Economic growth came at a terrible cost. Enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to North America to labor on plantations, particularly in the southern colonies. Slavery became deeply embedded in colonial society and economy, creating wealth for some while inflicting unimaginable suffering on others. This contradiction between ideals of freedom and the reality of bondage would haunt America's future. 7. Slavery and the colonial economy. Economic growth came at a terrible cost. Enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to North America to labor on plantations, particularly in the southern colonies. Slavery became deeply embedded in colonial society and economy, creating wealth for some while inflicting unimaginable suffering on others. This contradiction between ideals of freedom and the reality of bondage would haunt America's future. 9. Conflict with indigenous nations. As colonies expanded, land became the central source of conflict. European concepts of private ownership clashed directly with indigenous ideas of communal stewardship. Treaties were frequently broken, violence escalated, and indigenous nations were pushed off ancestral lands. Colonization increasingly meant displacement. 10. Seeds of self-government. Despite British rule, the colonies developed local governments. Assemblies, councils, and town meetings allowed colonists to manage daily affairs. Over time, these practices nurtured a belief that people should have a voice in their governance, a belief that would later fuel rebellion. 11. Rising tensions with Britain. By the mid-18th century, Britain began tightening control over the colonies through taxes, trade restrictions, and military presence. Colonists increasingly resented decisions made an ocean away. The idea that loyalty required obedience began to fracture. 12. A world moving toward revolution. By the 1770s, the colonies stood at a crossroads. They were economically strong, culturally distinct, and politically restless. What began as distant settlements had evolved into societies ready to challenge imperial power. 13. Closing. The road ahead. European colonization transformed North America forever. It brought new societies into existence, but at devastating human cost. The stage was now set for rebellion, revolution, and the birth of a new nation. Phase 3, the American Revolution and the birth of a nation. 1. From colonists to revolutionaries. By the mid-18th century, the 13 colonies had changed. Generations had been born in North America, far from Britain. Colonists developed their own identities, economies, and political expectations. They still considered themselves British subjects, but increasingly questioned why decisions affecting their lives were made by a distant parliament across the Atlantic. 2. The cost of empire. Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War in 1763, but victory came at a high price. The war left Britain deeply in debt. To recover financially, Parliament turned to the colonies, raising taxes and enforcing stricter trade regulations. Colonists were expected to pay for an empire they had little voice in governing. 3. No taxation without representation. New taxes such as the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts ignited outrage. Colonists argued that taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. Protests spread through newspapers, pamphlets, and public gatherings. Political resistance became organized and increasingly vocal. For the Boston Massacre in 1770, tensions boiled over in Boston. A confrontation between British soldiers and colonists escalated into violence, leaving 5 colonists dead. Though small in scale, the event was amplified through propaganda and became a symbol of British oppression. 5. Resistance turns radical in 1773. Resistance reached a dramatic peak with the Boston Tea Party. Disguised colonists boarded British ships and dumped tea into the harbor to protest taxation. Britain responded with harsh punishment, tightening control and closing ports. Instead of restoring order, these actions united the colonies further. 6. The first shots of war in April 1775. Fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord. What began as an attempt to seize colonial weapons turned into armed conflict. The first shots of the American Revolution had been fired. There would be no easy return to peace. 7. Declaring independence as war spread. The question of independence became unavoidable. In July 1776, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia and adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document asserted that governments exist to protect natural rights, and that people have the right to overthrow tyranny. 8. A Revolutionary War. The war that followed was long and uncertain. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, faced the world's most powerful military. Battles were fought across cities, forests, and farmlands. Victory depended not only on force, but on endurance, strategy, and foreign alliances. 9. The role of foreign allies. France, eager to weaken Britain, became a crucial ally. French troops, ships, and financial support turned the tide of war. The American Revolution became part of a global struggle for power. 10. Victory at Yorktown in 1781. British forces under General Cornwallis were trapped at Yorktown by American and French troops. Facing defeat, Britain surrendered. The war was effectively over. 11. A new nation recognized in 1783. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. A new nation had been born, but independence was only the beginning. 12. Building a government from scratch. Victory raised new questions. How should the new nation govern itself? How much power should leaders hold? The early years were marked by debate, experimentation, and uncertainty. 13. Closing. The promise and the challenge. The American Revolution reshaped the world. It proved that an empire could be challenged, and that a nation could be built on ideas as much as territory. Yet the promises of liberty remained incomplete, setting the stage for future struggles. Phase 4. Westward expansion, slavery, and the Civil War. 1. A young nation looks west after gaining independence. The United States faced a defining question. What would it become? The Atlantic coast could no longer contain a rapidly growing population. Land symbolized opportunity, independence, and prosperity. For many Americans, the future lay to the west. This belief would shape the nation's destiny and its deepest conflicts. 2. Manifest destiny. By the 1840s, westward expansion became more than migration. It became ideology. Manifest destiny was the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent. It framed expansion as natural and righteous, masking the violence and displacement that followed. 3. The cost to indigenous nations. Westward expansion came at devastating cost to indigenous peoples. Treaties were broken, lands seized, and entire nations forcibly removed. The Indian Removal Act led to mass displacement, including the Trail of Tears, where thousands died during forced marches. Expansion meant survival for some and destruction for others. 4. New territories. Old questions. As new territories formed, a single question followed them. would slavery be allowed. Each new state threatened to upset the balance between free states and slave states. Compromises delayed conflict, but never resolved it. The nation expanded geographically, but fractured politically. 5. Slavery at the heart of the economy in the southern states. Slavery became the foundation of economic life. Plantations producing cotton, tobacco, and sugar relied on enslaved labor. This system generated enormous wealth, but through extreme violence and dehumanization. Slavery was not peripheral. It was central. 6. Life under slavery, enslaved people resisted in countless ways, through rebellion, escape, sabotage, and the preservation of culture. Families were torn apart, identity suppressed, yet community and hope endured even under brutal conditions. 7. Abolition and moral resistance. Opposition to slavery grew louder in the North. Abolitionists published newspapers, gave speeches, and organized resistance networks. The Underground Railroad helped thousands escape bondage, often at great personal risk. Slavery was no longer just political, it was moral. 8. A nation divides. Political compromise finally collapsed. Southern states feared the loss of slavery. Northern states opposed its expansion. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Soon after, Southern states seceded from the Union. The nation split in two. 9. The Civil War begins in 1861. War erupted between the Union and the Confederacy. What many believed would be a short conflict became the deadliest war in American history. Brother fought brother. Cities burned. Field became graves. 10. War, suffering, and transformation. The Civil War reshaped American society. Factories expanded, women entered new roles, and millions endured unimaginable loss. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war into a fight against slavery itself. 11. The end of slavery. In 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. Shortly after, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Freedom was legally secured, but equality remained elusive. 12. Reconstruction and unfinished promises. After the war, the nation attempted to rebuild. Formerly enslaved people sought education, land, and political participation. Resistance was fierce. Reconstruction promised transformation, but delivered compromise. 13. Closing. A nation remade and broken. By the end of the 19th century, America had survived expansion and civil war. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished. But deep wounds remained, wounds that would shape the nation for generations. Phase 5. America becomes a global power. Industrialization, world wars, and the Cold War won. From Reconstruction to industrial nation. By the late 19th century, the United States was transforming at unprecedented speed. Railroads stretched across the continent. Factories rose in cities, and new technologies reshaped daily life. America was no longer a primarily rural nation. It was becoming an industrial powerhouse. 2. Immigration and the urban explosion. Industrial growth demanded labor. Millions of immigrants arrived from Europe and Asia, seeking opportunity and escape from poverty. Cities swelled with newcomers. Tenements filled, cultures collided, and America's identity grew more diverse and more tense. 3. Wealth, inequality, and reform. Industrialization created immense wealth, but concentrated it in the hands of a few. Magnates controlled steel, oil, and railroads, while workers endured long hours and dangerous conditions. In response, labor unions and reform movements demanded change. Progress was hard-fought. 4. America steps onto the world stage. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States began asserting itself beyond its borders. Territorial expansion and overseas conflicts signaled a shift. America was becoming an imperial power involved in global affairs. 5. World War I. A reluctant entry when World War I erupted in Europe, the United States initially remained neutral. But economic ties, submarine warfare, and global pressure pulled America into the conflict in 1917. The war marked America's arrival as a major military power. 6. Between wars. Boom and collapse. The 1920s brought prosperity, cultural change, and optimism. Jazz-filled cities, industries expanded, and consumer culture flourished. Then, in 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression followed, shattering livelihoods and exposing economic fragility. 7. World War II and total mobilization. World War II transformed the United States completely. Factories shifted to wartime production, women entered industrial jobs, and the nation mobilized on a massive scale. The war ended the Great Depression and solidified America's industrial dominance. 8. Victory in a New World Order. In 1945, the war ended with Allied victory. The United States emerged economically strong and militarily unmatched. Europe lay devastated. Power had shifted across the Atlantic. America now stood at the center of global leadership. 9. The Cold War begins. Victory quickly gave way to tension. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers. Ideology divided the world. Capitalism faced communism. The Cold War had begun, without direct battle, but constant threat. 10. Nuclear age and global anxiety. The development of nuclear weapons changed everything. Fear became a constant presence. Civil defense drills, underground shelters, and political paranoia defined the era. The world lived under the shadow of annihilation. 11. Technology, space, and competition extended beyond Earth. The space race became a symbol of technological and ideological superiority. Scientific achievement turned into national pride. 12. Social change at home. While America projected power abroad, it faced challenges at home. Civil rights movements demanded equality. Protests questioned authority and war. The promise of freedom was being re-examined. 13. Closing. A superpower with contradictions. By the late 20th century, the United States stood as a global superpower. Its influence was unmatched, but so were its contradictions. Wealth and poverty, freedom and fear, leadership and resistance coexisted. The American story was far from complete. Phase 6. The United States in the 21st century. Power, division, and the future one. A world after the Cold War. When the Cold War ended in 1991, the United States stood alone at the peak of global power. The collapse of the Soviet Union removed its greatest rival, leaving America as the world's dominant military, economic, and cultural force. Many believed history had reached a turning point, that liberal democracy had triumphed. 2. Globalization and economic transformation. The late 20th and early 21st centuries were defined by globalization. American companies expanded worldwide, supply chains crossed continents, and digital technology reshaped work and communication. Prosperity increased, but unevenly. While some thrived, others were left behind. 3. September 11th and a changed nation. On September 11th, 2001, terrorist attacks struck the heart of the United States. The attacks shattered a sense of security and reshaped national priorities. War, surveillance, and fear became central features of American life. 4. War on terror and endless conflict. The United States launched wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, seeking security and stability. Years turned into decades. Victory proved elusive. The cost in lives, resources, and trust was immense. That America's role in the world grew more complicated. 5. Technology, media, and identity. Social media, smartphones, and digital platforms transformed how Americans communicate and see themselves. Information spread instantly. but so did misinformation. Technology connected the nation while deepening divisions. 6. Inequality and economic anxiety despite immense wealth. Inequality widened. Housing, healthcare, and education became increasingly out of reach for many. Economic anxiety shaped politics and daily life. 7. Political polarization, political divisions hardened into identity. Trust in institutions eroded. Elections became flashpoints. Dialogue turned into confrontation. Democracy itself was questioned. 8. Race, justice, and social movements. Long-standing issues of race and justice resurfaced with renewed urgency. Protests demanded accountability, equality, and reform. The nation confronted unresolved legacies of its past. 9. Climate change and the environmental challenges grew impossible to ignore. Wildfires, storms, and rising seas tested infrastructure and leadership. Climate change became both a scientific and political struggle. 10. America in a multipolar world, new powers emerged globally. China, the European Union, and others challenged American dominance. The United States remained influential, but no longer unchallenged. 11. Democracy under pressure, misinformation, distrust, and political extremism tested democratic institutions. The strength of American democracy became a central question of the era. 12. The American idea in the 21st century. What does it mean to be American today? The answer varies, shaped by history, struggle, and hope. The American idea remains contested, evolving, unfinished. 13. Closing. An ongoing story. The United States was never a finished project. Its story is one of ambition and contradiction, progress and pain. The future remains unwritten. What comes next will depend not on destiny, but on choice.